In 2014, a new game called The Forest started gaining attention when it released as an early access beta. After its full release in 2018, the game had sold 5 million copies. As an open-world survival horror game, the developers focused on making a realistic-looking and feeling hostile environment. The main way this was achieved was through the enemies in the game. Referred to by the game's creative lead as cannibals, mutants, or the enemy threat, the main antagonists are built upon the trope of the bloodthirsty savage. Combined with the narrative frame of the protagonist as a victimized Westerner in a hostile environment, The Forest is just one instance of a game that casually embeds the colonial perspective, which reproduces stock stories, representations, and otherization of Indigenous peoples. One of the 2 reviews advertised on the game's official website quite literally spells this out. It starts with a plane crash. Pinned to your economy class seat with a small boy clutching your arm, you see the jet split as it careens into the titular forest, a rugged stretch of land that may or may not be an island inhabited by crazed, bloodthirsty natives. Sabine Herer's critical lens of the casual provides a framework for understanding how these representations and perspectives avoid scrutiny. Herer argues that if something is done casually, it is done without expenditure of great effort, in a leisurely way or outside the confines of a regulating gaze. The casual feigns disengagement with, renders unimportant, and therefore belittles attempts to identify colonial tropes in video games. As a game, it is seen as a harmless utility for entertainment and fun, which does not merit critical analysis. As Herer states, the colonial fantasies so central to the mechanics of many video games can be downplayed as just fiction. This means that the reality effects that colonial images might have on players, including dealing with the detrimental consequences of seeing one's people repeatedly vilified or victimized, can be dismissed as well. If games are the product, not the content of play, post-colonial critique and cultural critique in general can be declared irrelevant. Indigenous critics have been on the forefront of responses to the casual settler colonialism that pervades popular culture representations of indigeneity. Sarah E. K. Smith and Carla Taunton's paper, Unsettling Canadian Heritage, Decolonial Aesthetics in Canadian Video and Performance Art, notes how tropes of Indigenous peoples are reproduced for Western consumption, using the example of the Canada 150 Indian Village. They cite Indigenous critics Erica Violet Lee and Hayden King's response to these installations. Comprised of familiar tropes ready for Canadian consumption, tanned hides, basket-making workshops, and bannock over a fire. These stereotypes not only deny both the specificity of individual nations and the present-day existence of Indigenous communities, but as Lee and King argue, treat Indigenous cultures and people as a source of entertainment. Nathan Lagasse states that these stereotypes have been present in video games since their genesis, rooted in portrayals seen in mainstream media. Virtually since inception, video games have most often reinforced harmful tropes surrounding Indigenous peoples. Most involve portrayals of characters, environments, and stories that reenact images found in Hollywood movies, television series, and comic books. Through generations, pop culture media has framed the othering of Indigenous cultures, traditions, communities through representations now known as the noble savage, red-skinned redeemer, and the bloodthirsty savage. As digital media expanded into video game media, it carried over othering scenes that comparatively displaced Indigenous imagery. Lagasse found these representations so prevalent that he created a website to catalog the various instantiations of them. The goal of indigitalgames.com was to promote conversations on how games reinforce harmful characteristics involving Indigenous cultures, traditions, and communities. Focusing on what categories appear most frequently, each blog example examined a form of negative representation that limited and restricted positive Indigenous portrayals. Unfortunately, the site no longer exists, but if it did, The Forest and its enemies would surely be a most prominent example. Few reviewers seem to grasp the problematic nature of this game, but Reed McCarter, writing for CG Mag Online, sums it up. As much as The Forest's enemies are key to the experience, though, the player is often forced to wonder, at least a bit, about the responsibility of pitting a white protagonist against waves of mutants who, in appearance, closely resemble Aboriginal people. Infectious curse or not, this trope relies on centuries of stereotypical perceptions of Indigenous populations as mindless savages, and the white explorer as a rationalist victim of brutality. The enemies may be dubbed mutants, but their appearance is modeled so heavily on actual Aboriginal groups that the end result, whether it's intentional or accidental, is disturbing. The final version of the game absolutely needs to address this issue in some narrative form, because as it stands, the enemy is unsettling for reasons other than what we can assume Endnight Games is aiming for. The game did try to address this issue in some narrative form, but in a superficial and compensatory way, as the narrative is buried deep into the endgame, and the developers have made it clear that it is almost completely irrelevant. Ben Falcone, the game's creative lead, has said, "There is a way to end it, but I think a lot of players will play it without ending the game or even realizing that there is an ending. Players actually can uncover where these mutants came from and who they are and what the forest actually is, but we don't push players in any way to actually do any of that." This is indicative of the devs knowing that the fun of their game is not in pursuing the mysterious narrative of uncovering the secrets of the island and finding your son, but in playing out the white settler colonialist fantasy of expansionism and Aboriginal genocide. Jacob Utenauer makes a relevant point about this type of play with regards to the games GTA 4 and Clash of Clans, which can be applied to the forest as well. He argues, "The lesson that emerges is that improvement is the ultimate end goal, and territorial expansion leads to increased resources that can be used in the service of future upgrades and improvements. This perpetuates a never-ending cycle with limitless borders. There is no end to the frontier in a digital world. These ideologies can be perpetuated indefinitely." This settler colonial perspective is even more apparent in other comments Falcone has made, as well as the marketing materials present on the game's website, all while maintaining the false premise that the focus of the game is on finding your son. "We want players to eventually build up a stash of weapons, cover themselves in armor, and then take on the enemy directly, find their missing kid, and try to escape the forest. Complete player freedom. Chop down trees to build a camp or start a fire to keep warm. Scavenge food to keep yourself from starving. Find and plant seeds to grow food. Build a small shelter or a large oceanside fortress. Decorate your home with found items. Lay traps and defenses to keep a safe perimeter. Gameplay. Explore and build during the day. Defend your base at night. Craft weapons and tools. Bunker down during the evening or bring the fight directly to the enemy." The developers of the game also seem to want to humanize this enemy, perhaps in an effort to make the sense that you are committing genocide all the more convincing and powerful, while also maintaining the frame of them or us, defending in order to survive, sentiments which echo the mantra of Manifest Destiny. Investing in the cannibals' believable emotional reactions has been a big focus of the AI. Cannibals attempt to protect members of their family during combat, dragging downed comrades to a safe distance, so if they come across a slain family member, they may spend a moment mourning the loss, which has gameplay implications, by giving the player a chance to sneak up on occupied enemies. Cannibals that see a member of their tribe killed by the player will react differently depending on who was killed and in what manner. For example, killing a female in front of a group of males is generally not a good idea. Cannibals that are slain in a particularly brutal manner may even freak everyone out, causing them to temporarily flee. There is a balance between survival and dealing with the cannibal threat. We want to give players as many options as possible to deal with the cannibals. Everything will come at a cost though. You won't always want to attack them straight on. You will be able to build traps and bombs. You can also sneak into the caves during the day to try and thin out their numbers. Falcone cites I Am Legend and Cannibal Holocaust as major influences with their not too subtle, "Who are the real monsters" theme. You've invaded their forest, you're murdering them, you're chopping down all their trees. Maybe they're just trying to survive in this forest. Maybe you're the bad guy. So we try to make it emotional when you kill one of them and have them care. They're not all bad, even if they are trying to eat you. This is made all the more obvious by the player interpretations of these enemies. And while the developers never use the word Indigenous or Native, these meanings are clearly signified to the players. When the search terms "the forest" are entered onto YouTube, many videos in the first 10 results are also indicative of this.
So are these airplane people?
No, these are natives.
A sanity score tracks how far you're willing to go to survive, up to and including going native and cannibalizing the cannibals.
Will the natives become restless? With you being so slow compared to the natives, your mass deforestation and general meddling gets the natives really angry.
With one particular review by the Mandalore Gaming channel making the colonial perspective and theme of Manifest Destiny quite overt.
Ultimately, you're in their woods, so peace is never a true option. Oh well. Hey, they started it.
These embedded stereotypes and perspectives become more apparent when they are presented in this way, but for many players these aspects may not be as visible. Harrer argues that this can be due to the normalized expectation of the colonial perspective in video games. If colonial imagery does not emerge from intention, but from the casual reproduction of what seems natural, game design reproduces and appropriates colonial tropes by default. Uteneuer notes in his analysis of how this can be done easily, the fact that settler colonialism is in itself a process has led to its quick, seamless, and thoughtless incorporation into video games, which are themselves the result of a compiling of processes. He also argues that these representations in video games can provide a new way of analyzing the systems of settler colonialism. Because of the ways the structure of settler colonialism has become normalized through the U.S. law, the Dawes Act of 1887, for example, and the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, and reductive yet popular depictions of Indigenous people, looking at representations of indigeneity in digital spaces and video games offers a fresh, defamiliarized opportunity to analyze these structures. Smith and Taunton argue that art which presents decolonial aesthetics/relations can have the effect of placing Indigenous perspectives and self-determined representation at the forefront, and the unearthing of colonial apparatuses and unsettling of settler apathy, privilege, and society. This can be true of video games as well. As Lagasse states, Indigenous game developers use video games to address and fight these tropes through constructing positive images of Indigenous peoples, cultures, traditions, and communities. Indigenous video game developers are engaging in telling their community stories to create a counterbalance to mainstream video games and media interpretations of what Indigenous communities, cultures, and traditions are within the digital format. Jarrett Martineau and Eric Ritzkes argue in their paper Fugitive Indigeneity, Reclaiming the Terrain of Decolonial Struggle Through Indigenous Art, that Indigenous art reclaims and revitalizes the inherent creative potentiality of art to be activated in political struggle, not as an inseparable aesthetic experience, but embedded in the embodied daily life experience of Indigenous peoples, settlers, and others globally. One example is the Anishinaabe Minecraft world. Developed by teachers in the Louis Riel School Division in Manitoba, this game takes an Anishinaabe perspective that allows for a unique way of teaching and learning about Anishinaabe culture. Corey Kapilik, a Métis educator and the principal of Marion School, said, "Students have to understand that there was a worldview and a way of living and being that was sustainable, healthy, vibrant. If students understand the healthy community, understand how good things were here, then they can understand better the disruptions of residential schools, treaties, the Indian Act. Without that, we don't have the same context." Using games as a tool for knowledge keeping and world building with an Anishinaabe perspective has great potential for engaging younger students and audiences. Lagasse cites scholars Beth Lehman, Jason Lewis, and Scawanati Fragnito, who argue, the fluid, open, and networked characteristics of modern digital media make it particularly useful as a tool for Aboriginal storytelling. Lagasse states, "Youth involving themselves in digital media in many ways is a response to tropes and stereotypes established over generations of tropes in popular video games, but they also appreciate the opportunity for modern expressions of cultural aesthetics and nationhood that digital media can offer." Consultation of the Indigenous people being represented in creating digital representations of them is only the first step. Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, or ABTEC, describes itself as an aboriginally determined research creation network whose goal is to ensure Indigenous presence in the web pages, online environments, video games, and virtual worlds that comprise cyberspace. One of the significant projects that ABTEC initiated in 2006 is the Skins Workshop. Lehman, Lewis, and Fragnito describe a Skins Workshop as a workshop to a pedagogy that integrated North American Indigenous cultural frameworks into the design of video games and virtual environments. Skins provides instruction in digital design, art, animation, audio, and programming within a context of Aboriginal stories and storytelling techniques. Lagasse argues that workshops like Skins that work with younger generations of Indigenous youth help them to incorporate the values of traditional communities, culture, and traditions into digital environments, returning these games to the heart of the community. The Skins workshops have produced many successful small games which incorporate Indigenous storytelling, and ABTEC has created other significant game-based projects since. It is clear that video games and other art forms can be used as a tool for decolonization, but it is even more evident that the colonial perspective is, by default, embedded into video games, and that colonizer representations of Indigenous peoples are widely present in them. The otherization of indigenous peoples in video games is an extension and function of settler colonialism and serves to perpetuate the processes which compose the settler state. However, by applying an indigenous perspective and utilizing the world-building and representative capabilities of digital media, video games can serve as an avenue to decolonization.